wind was older than the mountains here. It moved through the high stones like a voice, carrying a sound that was not quite a word, and not quite the absence of one. Long before kings had names, before ink had touched papyrus, there were places like this, places carved, raised, or shaped by hands we can no longer picture, hands that understood the sky as if it were a map, and the earth as if it were a book written in stone. At the edge of a barren plain in what is now Western Europe, a ring of megaliths stands against the horizon. They are heavy beyond imagining, each one taller than a man and weighing as much as a ship, and yet they are balanced, poised, turned with such precision that at the exact moment of the midsummer sunrise, the first light pours through the circle's heart. No one alive remembers why this was done. The builders left no stories behind, only the stones, and the way they leaned toward the heavens as if still listening for something. Legends came much later. They said the stones could whisper, that if you stood within the circle at night and kept perfectly still, you would hear voices that belonged to no one. Shepherds swore the air was thicker there, as if you had stepped into a place between this world and another. Even the animals avoided it. Across the sea, on an island where the wind smells of salt and basalt cliffs fall into black water, there is another place, an underground chamber, narrow and cold, hidden beneath layers of earth and turf. Its entrance is so small a grown man must crawl to enter. Inside, the stone walls curve inward, meeting in a perfect corbelled roof, a design that should not have been possible for its time. And yet it stands, untouched by collapse for thousands of years. No sunlight reaches the inner chamber, but once each year, on the shortest day of winter, a single shaft of light travels the length of the passage, striking the inner stone with a glow like molten gold. Those who first witnessed this swore it was no accident, that the builders had shaped the earth itself to welcome the returning sun, and perhaps something more. Ancient folklore speaks of keepers who guarded such places. They were not priests nor kings, but something older, chosen not by bloodline, but by the stones themselves. In the dead of night, villagers claimed to see lights moving inside the earth, long before any torches were lit. Others told of soft music, too faint to place, too strange to be made by human hands. Far to the east, where desert meets sky in a pale and endless horizon, a different kind of wonder rests half buried in sand. A statue, faceless from centuries of wind, rises from the dunes. Its body is carved from a single block of stone, harder than any local quarry could provide. Modern scholars cannot agree on how it was transported here. There are no roads, no river to carry it, and yet it stands, staring toward a point on the horizon that aligns perfectly with the setting sun on the equinox. Travelers speak of a feeling there, an unease that grows as you approach. Not fear, but the weight of being observed. Some have said the statue changes ever so slightly between visits. A tilt of the head, a shift in the shoulders, as though it were listening to those who pass. There are stories, too, of men who tried to take pieces of these monuments home. Stone chips, carved fragments, small enough to fit in a pocket. Many of them never returned from the desert. Those who did came back altered, silent, withdrawn, unable to describe what they had seen, except to say that they no longer dreamed in their own voice. In the highlands of Central America, hidden beneath a canopy of thick green, their stone faces carved into sheer cliff walls. Their eyes are narrow, their mouths curved into something between a smile and a grimace. Moss grows thick in the grooves of their features, and vines curl through their hollow eyes. The people of the forest say the faces are alive, that they watch the river below, counting the souls who pass. No one knows who carved them. No one remembers when. Some archaeologists believe they are markers, warnings to stay away from certain parts of the jungle. But those who live nearby tell another story, that the faces are guardians, bound to keep something inside the earth, not out, and that if you look into their eyes too long, you may feel them looking back and not let go. In every corner of the world, there are places like these, wonders left behind by hands we cannot name. Some are aligned with the stars, others with the rising of the moon or the turning of the seasons. They are built with knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for their age, yet touched by something that does not belong entirely to reason. The people who came after, our ancestors, treated them with caution. They left offerings at their edges. They stepped lightly, spoke softly, and did not linger after dark. Perhaps they knew something we have forgotten. Perhaps the whispers that rise from these stones are not simply the wind. And so, these places remain silent in the daylight, and yet never entirely still, waiting for someone to stand in the right place, at the right moment, and hear what has been waiting to be heard for thousands of years. But the trouble with listening to the past is that sometimes the past listens back. The desert at night is a place of silence, so complete it feels like a weight upon the chest, and yet in that silence, there are voices not heard by the ear, but felt in the bones, the kind of murmurs that seem to come from the sand itself, drifting just below the reach of understanding. Travelers speak of a plateau far from the roads where black stones rise from the earth, like the broken teeth of some ancient creature long dead, each stone carved with lines that twist and loop into shapes unknown to any living tongue. They say, when the moon is full, the carvings glow faintly like embers that refuse to fade, and in the stillness between the gusts of wind, you can hear a faint hum, not loud, not clear, just enough to make the skin prickle, as though the air itself remembers something terrible. There is a cave system hidden in the mountains of the far north, where ice never melts even when the sun lingers on the horizon for days. Within those frozen chambers lie carvings of strange winged beings with eyes that follow you no matter where you stand. The explorers who have returned speak of sudden darkness, swallowing their lanterns, of footsteps echoing behind them, though they walked alone, and of voices whispering in languages they did not know. Some said the walls seemed to breathe slowly, as if the mountain itself was alive and waiting. In the middle of a salt flat where nothing grows, stands a single pillar of red stone, smooth as glass and warm to the touch even under the cold stars. It has no markings, no cracks, no sign of how it came to be there. Local legend claims it was placed by the first ones who walked the earth before men, and that it sings when the wind comes from the east, not with a tune, but with a sound that makes the heart beat faster, and the mind remember dreams you never had. Across an ocean in the shadows of dense rainforest, there is a staircase carved into a cliff that leads to nowhere, each step worn as if by countless feet, yet ending abruptly at a sheer drop hundreds of meters above the canopy. The steps are flanked by figures carved into the rock, their faces serene, their hands clasped together as though in prayer. When storms roll through the jungle, villagers say lightning strikes the steps again and again, never touching the trees around them, and that sometimes at night the figures are no longer clasping their hands, but holding them out as if beckoning. Some wonders hide beneath the sea where light fades into a green twilight. Divers tell of stone avenues running for miles across the ocean floor, lined with statues so eroded they seem almost human, but not quite. The currents there are strange, cold and fast in a way that makes no sense, pulling at the body as though trying to lead you somewhere further down, deeper. Still, one diver swore he saw a gate of black stone standing alone, with nothing behind it, framed by two figures whose eyes shone faintly even through the water. When he blinked, they were gone, yet the pull to swim through the gate was almost too strong to resist. In the heart of a desert canyon lies an arch of pale stone that glows with the colors of sunrise. Even in the dark, those who pass under it report vivid visions of places they have never been, sometimes of people they have never met. One wandering merchant claimed he saw a city made of mirrors stretching to the horizon. Another spoke of walking through halls of fire where shadows moved without their owners. No one stays near the arch for long because the visions do not stop. When you leave, they follow you into waking life, appearing at the edge of your sight and whispering just beyond your hearing. There's a hill in the old country that locals call the Mound of Breath. On certain nights, a thin mist seeps from the earth, there curling into shapes that look like faces drifting upward before vanishing into the air. The ground at the summit is warm even in winter, and no snow will settle their old stories. Say the mound was a door to the underworld, sealed by those who feared what lay beyond. Sometimes at night a deep, slow exhalation can be heard from beneath the soil, and once every generation someone claims to see the earth shift as if something below had stirred. In a remote valley where the wind never stops stands a wall of stone stretching from one cliff to the other, smooth and unbroken. Its surface bears no tool marks, no sign of its builders. The wall hums softly when touched, and those who linger near it claim their thoughts are no longer their own whispers, fill their minds, urging them to climb, to cross, to see what lies on the other side. Yet the top of the wall vanishes into the clouds, and no one who has attempted the climb has ever been seen again. On a plain of black volcanic rock, a circle of towers rises, each one carved from a single block of stone so massive it would take modern cranes to lift them. The towers lean inward toward an empty space at their center, and at dawn the first light of the sun passes through them in such a way that it casts a perfect spiral on the ground in the middle. No one knows why it was built, but travelers say that standing within the spiral makes the air taste of metal and fills your mouth with the urge to speak words you do not understand. There's a forest in the east where the trees grow in perfect lines, forming corridors that stretch on without end. The trunks are white, the leaves a deep red that never fades, even in winter. People who enter say the forest is silent, no birds, no insects, no sound of wind in the branches, and that the deeper you go, the less you remember why you came. Those who return sometimes find their hair streaked with white, or their eyes reflecting the red of the leaves. Even years later, these wonders are scattered like seeds across the skin of the world, some hidden, some waiting in plain sight, all of them older than the oldest stories, all of them carrying whispers too quiet for the careless to hear. Perhaps they were built as messages, perhaps as warnings, perhaps as traps, and yet we keep finding them, and we keep listening. For in every human heart there is a hunger to know, to touch, to stand where the ancients stood, and to hear the same voices they once heard. But there is a danger in listening too closely, for some whispers do not fade. Once heard, they follow you, they change you, they make you part of the story, and sometimes part of the thing that whispers back. The sands of Egypt had been waiting for more than 3,000 years, waiting beneath a skin of gold light and shadow that shifted with every wind that passed over the Valley of the Kings, waiting for a hand brave enough or foolish enough to reach into the silence and disturb what was never meant to be touched. It was the winter of 1922 when the valley gave up its secret. The British archaeologist Howard Carter stood at the threshold of a sealed doorway. In the thin morning air, the heat of the desert had not yet begun to burn. The stones around him were cool and silent. Behind them lay a tomb untouched since the reign of a boy who had once ruled all of Egypt. Tutankhamun, the boy king whose short life had been a flicker of light between two shadows. The entrance was small and unimpressive, just another cut in the rock face. But Carter's hands trembled as he brushed away the last of the rubble. The workman stepped back. There was a smell in the air, not of decay, but of something closed for far too long. He pressed a chisel into the seam. The plaster cracked. A thin breath of ancient air slid past his cheek, like the sigh of a ghost. Lord Carnarvon stood behind him, the man whose fortune had funded the search, his face pale against the desert sun. He asked Carter if he could see anything. Carter bent forward to peer through a small hole, and there in the dark something glittered. It was not the glint of a single object, but 1,000 tiny sparks, gold catching the light of his candle. He whispered words that would be repeated for generations. Yes, wonderful things. They broke through. Inside, the air was thick. It pressed against the lungs. Dust swirled in the lamplight, each grain a fragment of time itself. Furniture inlaid with ivory stood just as it had on the day of burial. Gilded chariots leaned against the wall. Statues stared from shadowed corners, their eyes black and watchful. The smell of resin and old wood clung to everything, and in the center of it all stood the great nested shrines that guarded the sarcophagus of the boy king. At the doorway to the burial chamber, carved faintly into the plaster, were words in the ancient tongue. Not a blessing, not a prayer, but a warning. Death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. The men laughed quietly at the superstition. They were scholars, not children. But the workers from the village shifted uneasily. One muttered a prayer under his breath. Another turned his eyes to the sand, refusing to look at the inscription again. Days later, the treasures began to be catalogued and removed. But the tomb had already claimed its first price. A cobra, the symbol of the pharaoh's protection, was seen coiled in Carter's house. It had entered the birdcage and swallowed his canary whole. To the locals, this was no accident. The cobra was the crown of Egypt itself striking at the intruder. Then came the fever. Lord Carnarvon had been shaving when he nicked a small wound on his cheek. It was nothing at first, but within days he was bedridden, his body burning, the wound festering in a way the doctors could not explain. On the night he died, all the lights in Cairo went out at once. His dog, thousands of miles away in England, began to howl and dropped dead at the exact moment. The newspapers called it the curse of the pharaoh. They listed the names of those who had entered the tomb, and one by one, they began to die. A British aristocrat who had visited the tomb was found dead in his London apartment. A member of the excavation team died of pneumonia only weeks later. Another collapsed in a Cairo club, dead before he hit the floor. The pattern was too sharp, too quick, for coincidence to silence. Carter himself dismissed the idea of a curse. He said the deaths were tragic chance. But those who had seen his eyes in the weeks after Lord Carnarvon's passing said there was a shadow there that had not been before. He spent more and more nights alone at the site. Sometimes he would be seen standing in the entrance of the tomb long after the others had left. As if listening, the local villagers whispered that the boy king's Ka, his spirit, had been awakened, that it now moved through the desert, seeking the scent of those who had entered his chamber. Even the wind in the valley seemed to change, carrying a faint, almost human cry through the cliffs at night. The treasures of Tutankhamun would eventually be displayed in museums, their gold dazzling under bright electric light. But for those who had been there in that first moment, who had breathed the stale air of a sealed kingdom, the memory remained heavy and cold. A door once closed had been opened, and doors once opened are not always eager to be shut again. Beneath the carved warning in the tomb's entrance, fine cracks had begun to spread through the plaster. Some said it was simply age. Others swore the cracks formed in the shape of wings. And in the deep stillness of the burial chamber, the air felt as though it were waiting. The heat of the desert was relentless as the days passed, yet in the Valley of the Kings a colder presence seemed to stir in the shadow of the boy king's tomb. The work continued, but the men began to speak in whispers, their eyes shifting toward the sealed chamber, as though it might hear them even through the stone. It was not only the great men who felt a strange fate. A messenger boy, who had carried letters between the camp and the city, was struck by a sudden illness, his skin turning pale, his breath rattling like dry leaves. He was gone within a day. The doctors could find no cause, and the villagers nodded to one another, saying the spirit was angry. One of the water carriers slipped on the rocky path, his body tumbling down into the narrow ravine, his neck broken by the fall. The place where he landed lay directly in line with the setting sun on the equinox, and the old men of the village murmured that the dead king's shadow had claimed another. Even those far from Egypt felt the reach of whatever had been awakened. A financier who had handled the shipment of artifacts from Cairo to London died in his sleep, his face frozen in an expression of horror. A nurse who had treated Carnarvon's fever collapsed during her rounds and never rose again. These were small names in the eyes of the world, but to those who kept the count, they were more feathers added to the wings of the curse. The nights in the valley grew uneasy, wind curling through the cliffs in long-drawn sighs, the sound sometimes taking on the tone of a child's voice, a faint, almost playful whisper that made the hair rise on the back of the neck tense, shivered though the air was still, and the scent of resin and old linen seemed to drift from nowhere. Howard Carter kept his composure in public, but in the darkness his dreams began to change. He dreamed of long corridors carved deep into the rock, of standing at the end of a hall, while unseen footsteps echoed closer and closer. He woke with sand on his hands, though he had not left his bed. One evening after the others had gone, Carter lit a single lamp and stepped alone into the burial chamber. The walls glowed in the lamplight gold, and deep red the painted scenes of gods and spirits watching him in silence. He felt the weight of their eyes, the stillness pressing against him. He placed his hand on the great shrine that held the sarcophagus, and for a moment thought he felt it pulse beneath his fingers, as if the wood itself drew breath. Outside in the village, the older women still left small bowls of milk at the edge of the desert for the spirits of the dead. They warned their children never to follow the archaeologists into the valley. After dark, they said the boy king had been wrong, taken before his time, buried with rites to keep him at peace, and that disturbing his rest was like striking a snake in its sleep. The British press, however, turned the stories into a spectacle. They called it the mummy's curse, printed long lists of the dead, speculated on ancient poisons and invisible spirits. The more the list grew, the more people believed, and belief itself has a way of feeding a shadow. Months passed, and the inner sarcophagus was opened, revealing the mummy of Tutankhamun. His face, still framed by the golden mask, the sight was both magnificent and unsettling. The mask's eyes were sharp and unyielding, as though they saw through the centuries, and straight into the heart of the living. The air grew heavy in the chamber, and several of the workers refused to remain inside. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers to older gods. In Cairo, a scholar who had translated the tomb's inscriptions was struck by a carriage in the street, dying before help could reach him. In Paris, an artist who had sketched many of the treasures collapsed without warning. His final drawing, unfinished, a depiction of the winged goddess Maat, who weighed the hearts of the dead. The curse, it seemed, did not care for distance. It followed names, not places, and in quiet corners of Cairo's hotels and in the tea rooms of Luxor, there were whispers that the Ka of the boy king had found its hunters and was marking them one by one. Yet Howard Carter lived on through it all, his health unbroken, his will unchanged. Some said he had been chosen not as a victim, but as a witness, the one who would see the curse through to its final turn. He himself spoke little of the deaths, but he kept the warning inscription in his notes and refused to allow it to be removed from the record. By the time the tomb was fully cleared, more than a dozen names had been added to the silent list of the dead, each tied by blood, by touch, or by sight to the day the seal was broken. The treasures were packed and sent away, but the valley did not return to silence. The wind still carried that thin, almost mocking voice at night, and the cliffs seemed to lean inward as though listening. Years later, when Carter was an old man, he visited the British Museum alone. The golden mask was not there. It remained in Cairo, but other treasures from the tomb gleamed under the lights. He stood before them for a long time, his reflection shifting across the glass, until in the corner of his eye he thought he saw another face beside his, smaller, darker, framed by a crown of gold and a cobra's hood. He turned quickly, but the gallery was empty. Yet, as he walked away, the faint smell of resin clung to him, and in his mind he heard again the warning carved into the plaster: death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king. Whether it was a curse, a coincidence, or the patient work of something older than time itself, no one could say, but the valley still lies under the sun. The tomb still sleeps beneath its weight of stone, and the warning waits for the next hand bold enough to break its seal. Some say the boy king is not finished, that his shadow moves in the heat haze above the desert, watching, listening, waiting for the day it will rise once more to claim what is his. The desert hides many things. It buries them under layers of wind and silence until even the memory of them is gone. But there are places where the earth seems almost unwilling to forget, where the sand shifts uneasily, as if guarding something beneath. Far to the northeast of the Nile's green life, where the river's gift fades into barren gold, there once stood the city of Tanis. It was a place of temples and markets, of stone streets that rang with the sound of sandals and the murmur of traders from distant lands. Here, pharaohs held court and priests whispered to the gods behind towering gates. The wealth of the delta flowed into its walls, and its statues stood as guardians to the kingdom's northern reach. Then the sky turned against it. The ancient texts tell of a time when the horizon darkened for days. A wall of wind and sand rose from the desert and fell upon the city with a fury that defied reason. Grain stores were buried, wells filled with grit, the air itself unbreathable. It was said that the storm carried voices, strange and mocking, that seeped into the dreams of the living. When the winds at last withdrew, they left behind a silence heavier than the storm itself. Plague followed. No one knew its cause. It came first to the palace guards, then to the scribes, then to the high priests themselves. Bodies were burned in great pits outside the gates. The smoke rose in black columns, mingling with the red haze of the setting sun. It was then the city's outer defenses fell, not to an enemy's army, but to their own neglect. Inscriptions from the time speak of the gods turning their faces away. And perhaps they had. When the archaeologists came, centuries later, they did not find a city toppled by battle. They found one half swallowed by sand, its avenues winding into dunes, its temples cracked, but still standing in eerie defiance of time. Inside those temples, something was wrong. The statues, once carved with care to honor the gods and the rulers, had been mutilated. Every face was gone, chiseled away with brutal precision. eyes, mouths, noses, erased as though the very idea of their gaze was too dangerous to remain. In one chamber, a colossal statue of PHARAOH'S still stood. Its body was intact, its posture regal, but where its face should have been there was only a smooth void. The stone around it was scarred with the marks of desperate tools, and on the floor below, in the dust, lay fragments of the missing features. No one knew who had done it. Some believed it was the work of invaders, others of the city's own people in a final act of rebellion against gods who had abandoned them. The locals told a different story. They said the faces were taken to keep them from seeing, that the gods' eyes could still look upon the living from their stone thrones, and in those last days the gaze had become unbearable. They spoke of dreams in which the statues leaned forward and whispered of deserts that would one day consume the whole earth. Even now, the modern villages that lie miles from Tanis refuse to go near after sunset. The elders say the city breathes at night, that if you stand on the edge of the dunes you can hear a slow inhaling, as if the sand itself draws breath. Those who camped there overnight spoke of finding their tents half buried by morning, the sand pressing in like water. Some swore they felt the ground shift beneath them in the dark, as though the city below was turning in its sleep. Archaeologists set up camps at the site, working under the hard glare of the sun. By day they uncovered columns etched with hieroglyphs of offerings and wars. By night they locked their tents tight against the wind. Yet even with the zippers drawn, the sand found its way inside, in their boots, in their food, in their blankets. One young researcher woke choking, her mouth filled with grit, as though something had tried to bury her while she slept. Among the artifacts was a slab of limestone covered in frantic carvings. The lines were crude, the language archaic. It spoke of the days when the air turned to fire, and of a voice in the storm calling the names of the dead. It warned that the city was not lost, only hidden, and that its shadow stretched farther than the dunes could cover. And in the heart of the ruins, beneath layers of collapsed stone, they found a tunnel. It led down into the dark, narrow and steep. The air there was stale, tinged with the scent of something sweet and rotting. The walls were lined with painted figures, their bodies still vibrant in red and gold, but their heads gone, cut away with the same ruthless care as the statues above. The tunnel ended in a sealed doorway of black granite. On it, faint and worn, was the image of a winged figure. Its face had been struck away, but the wings remained, stretching wide as if to shelter or to trap. The wind rose above the site, hissing through the empty windows of the temple like a voice too old to understand. The workers looked at one another, their tools suddenly heavy in their hands. No one wished to be the one to break the seal. Night came quickly in the desert, and with it, the sound the villagers had spoken of, a deep, slow breath from beneath the sand. It was not the wind. It was too steady, too patient, as if the city itself was aware of being found again. The wind that night was strange, moving in slow, heavy currents, as though it did not come from the desert at all, but from somewhere far below the earth. It carried with it a taste of stone and something faintly metallic, a scent that clung to the tongue and refused to leave the few who remained at the site, huddled in their tents, listening to the steady sigh that rose from the dunes, like the slow breathing of some vast hidden creature. One of the guards swore he saw movement near the temple, a shifting of the shadows across the wall that was not the work of any lantern. When he called out, there was no answer, yet the sand seemed to ripple, as though a shape had passed over it. Moments later, he returned to the camp, his voice shaking, saying that the statue of PHARAOH'S, though faceless, now seemed to be turned slightly, as if watching the place where the workers slept. In the early hours, just before dawn, one of the workers vanished, his bedroll empty, his boots still beside the flap of the tent. The others searched the dunes, but found no tracks, no sign of struggle, only a small depression in the sand near the entrance to the black granite doorway, as if someone had knelt there. For a long time the wind smoothed the surface, even as they looked, wiping away the only clue. When the sun rose, the team gathered at the sealed entrance. Some wanted to leave the site entirely, to let the city sink back into silence, but others argued that they had come too far to turn away. They began the work of clearing the doorway, chisels biting into the hardened seal, the sound echoing down the narrow tunnel like the tapping of distant drums. The stone gave slowly, as though resisting each strike, and as the last fragment fell away, a rush of air poured out carrying with it a chill that did not belong to the desert. Inside the chamber was darkness, so deep the lamplight seemed to sink into it. The walls glistened as though damp, but when touched they were dry, and warm, strange markings spiraled across them, marks unlike any hieroglyph known. Their shapes, curling like smoke frozen in stone. At the center of the room stood a single altar carved from the same black granite, its surface smooth except for a shallow groove that ran from one end to the other, as though something once rested there, something long and heavy. Around the altar lay fragments of gold leaf and pieces of shattered alabaster, their designs too broken to tell what they once formed, yet each piece carried the faint outline of a wing, a symbol repeated over and over, as if the entire chamber had been devoted to whatever that winged figure once represented. Above the altar, the ceiling curved into a dome, and in its center a hole no wider than a man's hand opened into darkness. As they examined the room, the wind outside rose again, pushing a low moan through the tunnel. It made the lamps flicker, casting the faceless painted bodies on the walls into motion. For an instant it seemed as if they leaned forward, their necks twisting toward the intruders. One worker cried out, dropping his lamp, and the flame guttered out in the stale air. The team withdrew for the day, yet even in the sunlit hours a shadow seemed to cling to the sight. Birds avoided the ruins, flying wide around the city. Stray dogs from the village would not cross the ridge that marked its boundary, and the workers spoke less, as if afraid their voices might carry into the stones themselves. That night a second man disappeared. The sand outside his tent was disturbed this time, as though he had been dragged away, the marks leading toward the heart of the city, and vanishing where the wind smoothed the ground. Some swore they heard faint footsteps on the stone streets, though no one was there. Others claimed they saw the dunes shift, as if something moved beneath the surface, circling the camp. On the third day they returned to the granite chamber and began to dig beneath the altar, their tools striking stone after only a short depth, revealing a narrow shaft that dropped into darkness. When a torch was lowered it revealed another room, far below the floor, its walls lined with tall, narrow niches, each holding what appeared to be a statue carved in black stone, every one of them faceless, their hands held out as if in welcome. One of the statues was toppled, lying across the floor, broken in two, and from the crack in its chest poured a dry powder the color of rust. The air grew thick with it, making the men cough and stagger. The dust clung to their skin and seemed to sink into their pores, leaving faint red stains that no water could wash away. That evening the breathing of the city grew louder, steady, and deep enough to make the sand tremble. Cups rattled inside the tents, and the lamps swayed. Without wind, the team leader ordered an immediate withdrawal, saying the site would be sealed until further study could be arranged. But the villagers watching from the ridge only shook their heads and said it was already too late, that once the city had taken a breath, it would not let go. When the last of the equipment was packed and the camels loaded, they left the ruins behind, yet the sand followed them for miles, carried on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. It settled into their clothes, their hair, their mouths, as though trying to find its way inside their bodies. In the months that followed, strange reports surfaced. Two of the workers fell ill with fevers that burned them hollow. One claimed to dream every night of walking through the streets of Tanis, hearing footsteps behind him, but never seeing who followed. Another was found dead in his home, his hands filled with sand, though his doors and windows had been locked from the inside. The artifacts removed from the site were placed in storage, yet the staff reported that the crates sometimes shifted on their own, and a faint sighing sound could be heard from within. On still nights, the gold fragments, with their wing patterns, grew dull and cold to the touch, as if the warmth of the living could not linger on them. Even now the dunes creep slowly over the ruins, swallowing the walls, the columns, the faceless statues, the black granite doorway, and the altar that waited in the dark. The villagers still avoid it at night, saying that the city breathes in the dark hours, and that the sand above it rises and falls like the chest of a sleeping giant, waiting for the moment when it will open its eyes again. The temple was older than the jungle that surrounded it, older than the cracked stone steps leading up to its shadowed doors, older, some whispered, than the language still carved into its walls. In the humid heat of an ancient Indian summer, the air inside was cool and dim. Shafts of sunlight fell through narrow openings high above, catching on motes of dust that swirled lazily in the stillness. And in the very center of the inner sanctum, standing upon a base blackened by centuries of offerings, was the idol. She was cast in bronze, her figure frozen in a posture both graceful and menacing. One hand raised, the other extended forward, palm open as if inviting or demanding something unseen. Her eyes were narrow slits, but in the half-light they gleamed with a reddish hue, a trick of the metal that seemed almost alive. She was known to the old priests as Kalima, the goddess of wrath, though some called her by names far older, names they would not speak after dark. It was said she was not merely an image, but a vessel, that her body of bronze contained something that listened, something that hungered, and that she would not be touched without a gift. The gift she had demanded since the first stone of the temple was laid. Blood. The rituals were simple if grim. A shallow bowl at her feet would be filled with fresh blood from animals or, in darker times, from the condemned. The offering would vanish, absorbed into the base of the statue, leaving no trace but a faint metallic scent in the air. Those who failed to give were said to wither within days. Not simply grow sick, but wither, their skin tightening, their eyes sinking deep into their skulls, their voices turning to dry whispers until they could no longer speak at all. The legend was so strong that even thieves avoided her. Temples were plundered, their gold stripped, their jewels pried loose. But the goddess of wrath remained untouched for centuries, until the British came. In the late 1800s, colonial officers entered the jungle on an expedition of maps and measures, their eyes set on the riches of the old kingdoms. They found the temple half hidden in vines, its roof sagging, but its inner sanctum untouched by time. The idol still stood in the center, her bronze skin gleaming faintly in the gloom. The officers laughed at the warnings of their guides, brushing aside talk of curses as native superstition. They ordered the idol removed, intending to ship it to Calcutta and from there to London, where it would take its place in a museum far from the soil that had birthed it. The removal did not go as planned. Ropes frayed and snapped as though they had been cut. Metal fittings bent without cause. And each man who tried to lift the idol from its base complained of sudden weakness, as if their strength had been drained in the instant they touched her. Still, they persisted, sweating under the heavy air of the jungle until at last they had it bound and ready for transport. That night, the first man fell ill. A strong young officer, the kind who had laughed loudest at the temple warnings, now lay on the dirt floor of his tent, shivering though the heat had not lifted. By morning his skin was pale, his eyes sunk deep, his voice little more than a rasp. Before midday he was gone. The others carried on, but a heaviness seemed to follow them down the river. One by one, the men grew sick. Some vomited blood, others simply wasted away, growing thinner with each sunrise until their uniforms hung loose on their frames. Within a week, 3 more were dead. The survivors reached the city, dragging the crate that held the bronze idol into the government storehouse. It was said that even before it was uncrated, a smell filled the air, not rot, but the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. The storehouse guards refused to sit near it at night, swearing they heard soft metallic creaks from inside, as though something within shifted when no one watched. When the crate was finally opened, the idol was found untouched by the journey. But her open palm, they said, was wet. The deaths continued. A clerk tasked with cataloging the statue collapsed over his desk, blood trickling from his nose and mouth. A laborer who had polished the base of the statue was found in his bed, his face twisted in such terror that his hands had clawed deep furrows into the wood of the bed frame. The physician called it a stroke brought on by fever. But those who had carried the idol knew better. Within a month, the decision was made to remove her from the city. She was to be shipped to England under guarded transport, the route kept secret, but she never arrived. The ship that carried her left the port under clear skies. It was found drifting days later, its sails torn, its hull scarred with strange gouges. The crew was gone, all of them, their gear still on board, their food untouched. Only the crate remained in the hold, empty. The idol was never seen again. Some believe she was thrown overboard by desperate sailors. Others say she walked from the ship into the sea, sinking to the depths with her hunger. But in the villages near the old jungle temple, the elders tell another story, that she returned to her sanctum, carried by the river in the dead of night, and that in the rainy season, when the water swells and the jungle breathes deep, you can still hear the faint metallic scrape of her palm opening in the dark, waiting for the next gift. The rains had come heavy that year, turning the jungle into a breathing green labyrinth, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and flowering vines. In the flooded lowlands, where the old river forked, the villagers said strange things began to happen. Fishermen, casting their nets at dawn, pulled them back, stained with a faint red haze that vanished in seconds. The elders warned them not to fish near the bend where the water turned dark and slow, saying that the goddess had returned and was drinking again. A boy wandering too far from his home claimed to have seen her. He said she stood at the edge of the water, her bronze skin slicked with rain, her open hand reaching down as if to touch the surface. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light of the storm. When he blinked, she was gone, but the prints of her feet were pressed deep into the mud and filled slowly with water, as though the earth itself wished to hide them. The stories traveled quietly at first only within the villages, yet traders passing through began to carry them farther to towns along the railway, and eventually to the city by the coast, where a man named Devereaux heard them. He was a collector of the strange, the forbidden, the things museums would not display publicly, but would pay handsomely to own privately. He hired 2 guides and set out into the jungle, determined to find the temple that had swallowed the statue back into its shadow. They found it half buried in vines and roots. The stone steps cracked the roof, sagging under the weight of centuries, but the air inside was cool, and still the sanctum at the center was empty save for a dark stain on the floor in the shape of a shallow bowl. Devereaux searched every corner with the impatience of a man who believes himself immune to the warnings of the dead. On the 3rd night the guides awoke to the sound of metal moving. They followed the echo to the sanctum and saw her there, where before there had been nothing, her figure gleaming faintly in the lantern light, as if she had always stood there waiting. Her hand was outstretched, the bronze, what though no rain had touched it. One of the guides fled into the jungle and did not return. The other tried to pull Devereaux back, but the collector stepped forward, drawn to the sheen of her palm. By morning only the guide remained. He found the collector lying before the idol, his face contorted in silent agony, his lips cracked, his skin pale as parchment. There was no wound, no mark, except for the faint trace of bronze dust on his fingertips. The guide left the body where it lay, sealing the temple door with stone before fleeing to the river. He never spoke of it again. Years later, during the Second World War, a patrol moving through the region reported finding the temple once more inside. They claimed the statue stood draped in vines, but untouched by corrosion, her eyes catching the sunlight that slipped through the broken roof. The soldiers joked about taking her back as a trophy, but when one of them laid a hand on her arm, he staggered back, clutching his chest, before collapsing dead on the floor, his blood pooling at the base of her feet. The others left her there, retreating without another word. In the decades that followed, the jungle swallowed the temple more completely than before. Satellite maps showed only dense green, where the river bent no sign of stone or roof, or the narrow steps that led into shadow. Yet the stories never stopped. Travelers told of seeing a figure at dusk, standing waist deep in the water, her bronze shining in the last light of the day, her hand reaching down into the current as if tasting it for the scent of life. Some nights, when the air was still, the sound of metal shifting could be heard drifting over the water, a faint scraping like the opening of a palm, and villagers woke to find their goats or chickens dead, their blood gone, though no wound marked their flesh. They would light fires on the shore and sing the old songs that once kept her satisfied, praying she would take the flames in place of the life she craved. There is a hill above the river where no trees grow, only grass that bends in the same direction, no matter how the wind blows. At the top of the hill is a stone the size of a man's chest, with a shallow groove cut into its surface. On nights when the moon is high, the groove gleams, as if what though no rain has fallen, those brave enough to touch it speak of a cold that spreads up the arm into the chest, a weight that lingers for days, leaving the skin smelling faintly of copper. In the city far from the jungle, there are collectors who still whisper about her. Some believe she is buried beneath the silt of the river, waiting for the right hands to lift her. Others think she moves at will, walking the riverbeds in the dark, feeding where she pleases, leaving no trail behind but a body pale and empty, and a scent in the air like fresh iron. There is even a story of a merchant who swore he saw her in the market one morning, a woman cloaked in red bronze glinting beneath the cloth, her hand resting on the edge of his stall. When he looked again, she was gone, and the place where her palm had touched the wood was stained dark and smooth. The jungle remembers, and it does not forgive those who disturb what it guards. The rains come, and go the river swells and falls, but somewhere in the shifting shadows of leaves and water the goddess waits her palm open, her eyes unblinking, her hunger endless. Those who live near her waters know to offer their tribute before taking what they need, for the price of forgetting is always paid in blood. And when the night is heavy and the air does not move, the river seems to hold its breath, and in the silence comes the faint metallic sound of a hand opening slowly in the dark. The ground was dry and cracked under the spring sun. In March of 1974, a group of farmers in Shanxi province dug their shovels into the hard earth, looking for water. Their well had long since run dry, and in the dust-blown fields, thirst was becoming an enemy more dangerous than hunger. The first clink of metal against clay came as a surprise. It was not the hollow sound of pottery jars or the dull weight of stone. It was sharper, like striking bone that had turned to rock. The men dug carefully, brushing away the soil until a face emerged, life-sized, expression calm, the eyes carved with such detail that they seemed to follow the sunlight as it shifted overhead. It was only the first of many. Within days, they uncovered more: heads, torsos, fragments of limbs. By the time officials arrived from Xi'an, it was clear they had stumbled upon something far larger than a forgotten village. An army was rising from the earth, one soldier at a time. In the months that followed, the scale of the discovery revealed itself. Row upon row of warriors stood in underground corridors, each one unique. No two faces alike, no two postures the same. Archers crouched in formation. Infantry stood at attention. Cavalry waited beside their horses, all frozen in the moment before battle. They had stood there for more than 2,000 years, guarding something hidden deeper still. The Terracotta Army was the burial force of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. He had united the warring states under one banner, forged an empire from chaos, and ruled with an iron hand. When he died in 210 BCE, his tomb complex was said to be the most elaborate ever built, a city beneath the earth, complete with palaces, treasure halls, and rivers of liquid mercury flowing between them. And above it all, standing eternal watch, his army of clay. But the people of the region had their own stories about what lay beneath. They said the emperor feared death so greatly that he called upon sorcerers and alchemists to protect him. They said his tomb was filled with traps, crossbows rigged to fire at any intruder, chambers sealed with poison, spells carved into stone that could steal the breath from the living. And they said the army itself was more than statues, that each clay warrior housed the spirit of a soldier who had sworn to protect the emperor in life and was bound to him still in death. The farmers who found the first warriors could not have known the weight of what they had uncovered, but the shadow of it began to fall over them quickly. One of the men, Yang Jifa, later spoke of how his life seemed to turn after that day. He and several others were removed from their land, their homes demolished to make way for the excavation. Promises of payment and reward turned to years of poverty. Some of the discoverers died young. Accidents, illness, and quiet despair took them one by one. The locals began to say the emperor was punishing those who had disturbed his guard. In the museum built beside the site, visitors sometimes spoke of strange feelings while walking among the warriors. The air seemed heavier, the silence almost oppressive. Some swore they heard the faint shuffle of feet, the sound of armor shifting, or the creak of bowstrings pulled taut. One guard told of hearing a whisper in his ear late one night when he was alone on patrol, words in a language he did not know, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. No one has entered the emperor's central tomb itself. Modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar have confirmed that it is there, a massive chamber beneath the burial mound, untouched since it was sealed over 2 millennia ago. Chemical analysis of the soil has found unusually high concentrations of mercury, lending truth to the old tales of deadly rivers running through the tomb. Historians believe the site could hold priceless artifacts and ancient texts lost to history. But the fear of traps, of contamination, and perhaps of something less easily explained has kept the chamber closed. The people of Shanxi say that is for the best. They tell of a dream that comes to those who get too close, a dream of standing in a vast hall lit by torches, the emperor seated on his throne of gold, his clay soldiers arrayed at his feet. In the dream, the emperor does not move, but his eyes follow you as you try to leave. And no matter how far you walk, the rows of soldiers stretch on forever, their silent watch unbroken. Even in daylight, the excavation pits have an uncanny presence. The warriors rise in perfect formation, their ranks stretching into the shadows at the far end of the hall. The clay is the color of dried blood, where the paint has long since faded. Some still bear the scars of fire, the result of ancient looting that could not destroy them completely. They stand as they have for centuries, patient, unyielding, and waiting. No one knows how long they will keep their watch, but those who believe in the curse say it will last until the emperor himself is disturbed. And when that day comes, the army will no longer stand still. The air inside the pits was heavy even in winter, carrying with it the scent of clay and earth that had been sealed away. For thousands of years, workers moved carefully between the ranks of the warriors, their footsteps muffled by the dust that never seemed to settle, each statue watching with sightless eyes, yet holding a presence so strong it was as if they could see. It was in the early years of excavation that the first strange accident occurred. A young archaeologist cataloging a group of kneeling archers lost his footing and fell into the pit. The drop was not far, but the moment he struck the floor, he cried out in pain, his leg twisted beneath him. What baffled the others was the wound on his arm, a thin, shallow cut, like the slice of a blade, yet no tool lay near him, and no one had touched him. Another worker collapsed without warning, his breathing shallow, his skin pale as the clay around him. He was carried out into the open air and revived, yet he claimed that before he fell, he had felt a sudden chill of breath on the back of his neck, and a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. When he turned, there had been nothing, only the endless faces of the army staring ahead. The locals who worked at the site began to speak quietly among themselves. They said the spirits of the soldiers did not like to be touched, that each one held the soul of a man who had once sworn his life to the first emperor, and would keep that oath even in death. They left offerings of incense and rice wine in the shadows of the pits, never where the officials could see. In the nearby villages, dreams began to spread like whispers from house to house, dreams of standing in a great underground hall, with a ceiling lost in darkness, the air thick with the smell of burning oil, and the sound of distant drums. In the dreams, a figure sat on a high throne, wearing the black armor of the Qin dynasty, his face hidden in shadow. The rows of clay soldiers stretched into the blackness, and somewhere beyond them, something moved, unseen but growing closer with each heartbeat. One of the guards at the museum swore that on a moonless night he saw a shimmer pass through the ranks of the warriors, as if a ripple of heat had moved over them. Though the air was cold, he heard the faint clink of metal, the sound of armor plates shifting under their own weight. He told no one for weeks, but the dreams came to him all the same. Not all the misfortune was quiet. One of the original discoverers who had guided officials to the site found himself stripped of his land, his fields paved over for the expansion of the complex. His compensation vanished into the pockets of others. Within a few years, he was living in poverty, his health failing, and his family gone. Some called it the cruelty of bureaucracy. Others whispered that the emperor had marked him for leading strangers to his guard. Beyond the excavated pits, the burial mound itself rose like a silent mountain above the plain. Modern instruments revealed the vast chamber beneath it, but still no one dared to open it. Legends told of rivers of mercury flowing through the halls of the emperor's palace underground, and the soil around the mound carried levels so high they would be deadly if disturbed. The texts also spoke of crossbows primed to fire on any who entered, and of spells etched into the walls to bind the spirits of the dead to their posts. In the stillness of night, the mound seemed to hold its own, whether a faint mist curling over it. Even in the dry season, the villagers avoided it at all times, saying the air there carried whispers, too low to understand, yet strong enough to make a man's skin crawl. Some claimed to see the shadow of the emperor himself, standing at the crest of the mound, his robe drifting in a wind no one could feel. Archaeologists from other lands came to see the army, and left with more than photographs. One researcher fell ill on the return journey, his lungs filling with fluid, though no infection could be found. Another began to lose his sight, without reason, his vision fading over weeks, until only shadows remained. He told his wife he felt as if unseen eyes had replaced his own, watching the world through him. There's a story told quietly in Xi'an of a night watchman assigned to guard the storage facility, where fragments of the warriors were kept in crates. During the restoration, he was making his rounds when he heard movement inside one of the sealed rooms. Thinking it was an intruder, he opened the door and found the room empty, except for a single clay head resting on a workbench, its eyes fixed directly on him, though it had been set to face the wall. He closed the door and walked away without looking back, and by morning he had resigned his post. The curse of the Terracotta Army is not written in blood on the walls, nor shouted in storms. It moves like the shifting of clay under the ground, slow and patient, and certain. Those who feel it often speak of an unease that never leaves them, a sense that somewhere in the darkness of the pits the soldiers know their name. The Emperor's Guard was built to last forever, and forever is a long time to wait. It is said that if the tomb is ever opened, the army will stir the crossbows, will fire the rivers of mercury, will run again, and the spirits of 2,000 years will walk under the open sky. But until that day they stand in silence, their feet rooted in the soil of their loyalty, their faces turned toward the throne that still waits in the shadows below. And above it all the mound rises against the horizon. It slopes quiet under the sun, but in the deepest hours of the night, when the wind has died and the stars are clear, the earth there seems to pulse like the slow beat of a heart that has not yet stopped. The wind off the desert carried a taste of dust and something older, the faint tang of stone that had been buried for centuries and was not pleased to see the sun again. In the ruins of Hatra, where the sandstone walls still stood against the sky like the ribs of some ancient beast, a team of archaeologists worked under the heat. They had come expecting shrines and statues, perhaps a few coins lost by the city's long-dead merchants. What they found instead lay deep inside a shadow chamber, half-collapsed and hidden behind a carved doorway that had not been opened in nearly 2,000 years. It was a library, or what remained of one. The shelves were stone, carved directly from the walls. They rose in tiers, each holding stacks of clay tablets and scrolls of brittle papyrus bound in tight rolls. The air was dry, almost too dry, as though the room had been sealed away from the world to keep its treasures alive. Faint carvings of winged figures and spiral patterns lined the walls, their meaning unclear. Some of the team thought they were purely decorative. Others noted their similarity to protective wards found in temples far older than Hatra itself. At the center of the chamber was a table of black basalt, smooth as glass, its edges engraved with a script few could read. A handful of inscriptions had already been translated by the time the first rumors began. The words spoke not of history or commerce, but of those who crossed the void on rivers of night, and rituals to call the years of the sky to the mouths of men. The translator laughed it off as ceremonial poetry, the sort of florid language priests often used. But the older diggers, men from nearby villages, refused to enter the room after sunset. For several weeks the team cataloged their findings. The tablets were carefully packed for transport to the city museum. The scrolls, fragile and crumbling, were laid out on clean linen to be photographed. But some of the oldest pieces resisted the camera. The film came back clouded, streaked with pale blue smears, as if touched by light that had no source. One technician swore he saw the letters moving, shifting across the page in a way that made his stomach turn. But when he blinked they were still. The fire began without warning. It was early evening, the sun low and red over the ruins, when one of the night guards saw a pale light flicker inside the library. He thought at first it was the lamp of a careless worker. By the time he reached the doorway, the room beyond was full of flames. But they were not the flames of wood or oil. They burned blue, almost white at the heart, and gave off no smoke. The scrolls curled and blackened instantly, yet the shelves that held them remained untouched. The basalt table shone in the strange light, its engraved script seeming to shimmer and deepen. The guard called for help, but when others arrived they could only stand at the threshold. The heat was intense, yet it did not spread beyond the doorway. It was as if the fire knew its bounds. In less than an hour it was over. The scrolls were gone, every last one reduced to a fine, dark ash that drifted in the still air and settled like a shadow on the floor. The stone walls were cool to the touch. The shelves were as they had been. Only the knowledge had been consumed. When they sifted through the ash, they found fragments of hardened papyrus, each marked with symbols too warped to read. And on the basalt table lay a single intact tablet, its surface smooth, the script sharp and untouched by the flames. No one could say why this one had been spared. The inscription on it, once translated, was short. Some words are too dangerous for mortal minds. The officials called it an accident, a tragedy, but nothing more. They blamed a spark from a lamp, a careless ember, carried by the wind. Yet those who had seen the flames knew better. There had been no sound of burning, no crackle, no roar. Only a low hum, deep and steady, like a note held in the throat of the earth itself. One witness, an old man from the village who had been hired to help carry equipment, later told a story he swore was true. He said that as the flames rose, he saw shapes moving within them, not people, not animals, but outlines of things that shifted and bent like smoke caught in a breeze. They seemed to pause at the edge of the basalt table, as if listening, and then, one by one, they stepped into the fire and were gone. The basalt table was moved to the museum along with the surviving tablet, but the locals said it should have been left where it was. That taking it broke whatever spell had contained the danger. Within weeks of its arrival, strange things began to happen. Locks rusted overnight despite the dry air. The guards reported hearing whispers in the storage rooms, voices speaking in a language none recognized. Once, a night watchman found the table wet to the touch, as though it had been standing in the rain, but the air around it was bone dry. And then the dreams began. The dreams began quietly, at first a guard waking with the taste of dust in his mouth, and the faint image of tall narrow doorways, in his mind another staff member speaking of a sound like wings beating slowly in the dark. Then more came, each dream different, but all sharing the same color of light, the pale blue of the fire that had consumed the library. Those who dreamed spoke of standing in a vast chamber beneath the ground, the walls lined not with stone, but with something smooth and cold that reflected their own faces distorted into shapes they did not recognize. In the center of the room stood the basalt table, and on it a single scroll, unburned, its edges glowing faintly, as if lit from within. When they reached for it, a shadow would fall across their hand, and the dream would end. The curator dismissed the talk as nervous superstition, yet he avoided the storage room at night. He had been the one to authorize the moving of the table, and though he would not admit it, the sound of that low hum seemed to follow him even into his home. His wife complained of waking to find him standing at the foot of their bed, staring at the wall, his lips moving, as if reading words she could not hear. Weeks passed before anyone noticed the marks. The stone floor beneath the table seemed to change, faint hairline scratches appearing and shifting from day to day. No one admitted to moving the heavy slab. Yet the patterns on the floor grew more complex, curling into spirals that looked almost like the carvings once seen on the library walls. A visiting scholar traced one of the spirals with his fingertip and flinched as though the stone had burned him. His finger was left with a faint blue stain that did not fade for days. In the market outside the museum, a fragment appeared for sale, a sliver of papyrus hardened into a brittle curl, its surface etched with the same symbols seen on the surviving tablet. The seller claimed it had been found in the ruins after the fire, untouched by the flames. Though buried in ash, a collector purchased it, and within a week was dead. His body discovered at his desk, his hand clenched around the fragment, his eyes open wide and reflecting a pale blue light that lingered for moments after he was found. Rumors spread of other fragments hidden away in private hands, each tied to illness or sudden misfortune, yet still they were sought by those who believed the scrolls held knowledge of power beyond the reach of ordinary man. The surviving inscriptions spoke of rituals to call beings from beyond the sky, beings that could walk between moments as easily as between rooms, and who listened for those bold enough or foolish enough to speak their names. One evening during the rainy season, lightning struck near the museum. The power failed, and the building fell into silence. When the lights returned, the cameras in the storage hall showed the basalt table, uncovered though it had been wrapped in thick canvas. Moments before, the footage revealed nothing of how it had changed, only that the carved lines along its edge now glowed faintly blue, the same unnatural color as the fire in Hatra. The following night, a guard failed to report for duty, his radio found on the floor still hissing with static. When they checked the security footage, his last recorded moments showed him standing before the table, head bowed, as if listening to something only he could hear. The feed ended in a wash of blue light that bled into the lens, and when the room was searched, there was no trace of him, no sign of struggle, only the faint smell of dust and rainwater in the dry air. The authorities considered sealing the storage hall, but the curator argued to keep it open, claiming that whatever force lingered might be studied safely. With enough caution, the locals shook their heads and said the library had burned itself to keep the words from crossing into the world, and that by moving the table the barrier had been broken. They warned that the flames would come again, not to destroy stone or paper this time, but to consume the minds of those who had read too much. One by one, members of the excavation team reported strange ailments, headaches that lasted for days, vertigo that struck without warning, dreams that blurred into waking until they could no longer tell which was which. Some left the city altogether, vanishing into distant provinces, leaving behind their work without explanation. The few who stayed rarely spoke above a whisper when discussing the library. The basalt table remains where it is, heavy and still, in the museum's deepest room, though some who have stood near it swear they feel a vibration like the beating of a distant drum, as if the stone itself remembers the chants once spoken over it on certain nights when the moon is hidden and the air is clear enough to hear the smallest sounds. The low hum can be felt through the floorboards of the museum, faint but steady like the last echo of a fire that refuses to die. The last words, translated from the surviving tablet, were added quietly to the official record. They read, not as a warning, but as a promise. What is written can never be unwritten, and what is called can never be sent away. Those who hear the call will open the door again, and when they do, the blue fire will return, not to cleanse, but to guide. And somewhere beyond the reach of sight, in a place where stone and sky are the same color, something is listening. The mountain air was thin, sharp enough to sting the lungs, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the ghost of snow from the peaks above. It was a place where clouds moved like living things, curling around the ridges and spilling into the valleys in slow, deliberate waves. On the highest plateau, where grass grew in thin patches between black rock, stood the stone. It was taller than two men, its surface dark and slick, though no water ever seemed to cling to it. Even in sunlight, it seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. And carved into its face were hundreds of symbols, shallow but precise, their edges worn by centuries of wind and rain. No one had ever translated them. No one could. The villagers in the nearest settlement called it La Voz de los Ancestros, the voice of the ancestors. They warned travelers not to go near it when the storms came down from the peaks, not because of lightning, though the plateau was bare and exposed, but because of the whispers. They said that when the rain struck the stone, it sang, not a song of melody or rhythm, but a low, layered murmur, as though 100 voices spoke at once in a language older than the mountains themselves. Some said the sound was inside the head, not the ear. Others swore it came from deep within the stone, as if it were hollow, and something within was trying to speak through the cracks. No one stayed to listen for long. The old stories said that those who tried were changed, that they would return to the village with a strange, distant look in their eyes, their speech slowed, their nights filled with muttering in that same unknowable tongue. A few never returned at all. For generations, the plateau was left alone, until a team of researchers arrived, carrying cameras, audio recorders, and the certainty that there was nothing here beyond geology and folklore. They set their camp within sight of the stone, its dark shape rising from the plateau like a sentinel. During the first days, the weather held clear, and the stone was silent. They mapped the carvings, tracing their shapes with chalk and photographing them from every angle. But the symbols refused to arrange themselves into any known script. Some resembled ancient Indian motifs. Others hinted at something more abstract, spirals within spirals, lines that bent and broke at impossible angles. One researcher remarked that the patterns gave him headaches if he looked at them for too long. On the fourth day, the weather changed. Clouds gathered low and heavy, and the first drops of rain tapped against the tent canvas. The team moved their equipment closer to the stone, eager to capture the fabled whispers for the first time on record. The sound began quietly, a faint vibration, not quite audible, more feeling in the bones than in the ear. Then, as the rain thickened, the voices emerged. It was impossible to count them. Some rose and fell in steady tones. Others crackled like words shouted from far away. The cadence was unlike any language the researchers knew, yet there was something deliberate in it, the pauses, the repetitions, the rising urgency. One of the team laughed nervously, saying it was just the wind catching in the carvings. Another shushed him, leaning closer, as if afraid to miss a single syllable. They did not notice when the audio equipment failed. The recorders clicked and stopped, their indicator lights flickering before going dark. The battery packs drained in minutes. Even the digital cameras refused to focus, their lenses sliding back and forth as though searching for something that wasn't there. The rain fell harder. The voices grew sharper, closer. One researcher stepped forward until he was only a meter from the stone. He tilted his head, listening intently. When his colleagues called to him, he did not respond. Only when they touched his shoulder did he turn, his face pale, eyes unfocused, lips moving soundlessly. They led him back to camp, but he did not speak again that night. In the morning, he could not remember what he had heard, or so he claimed. Yet in the quiet moments, he was seen tracing shapes in the dirt that matched the symbols on the stone's face. The storm lasted 3 days. Each time the rain began, the stone's voice returned. The researchers stopped trying to record it. The equipment would not cooperate. Instead, they took notes by hand, though their writing grew jagged and uneven as the hours wore on. 2 members of the team argued over the meaning of a repeated phrase they thought they could distinguish. The argument ended abruptly when one of them fainted, collapsing beside the fire with a fever that burned for the rest of the night. By the time the weather cleared, the stone was silent again. But the team was different. They packed their equipment in uneasy silence, avoiding the plateau as they left. Later in the city, several of them reported the same dream, standing in a vast cavern deep beneath the mountains, water dripping from unseen heights, the stone symbols glowing faintly in the dark. And in the center of the cavern, a shape they could not describe, except to say it was listening. In the months after the expedition returned, the villagers noticed small changes in the mountainside paths, stones arranged in unfamiliar patterns along the ridges, cairns built in places no one had reason to visit, and on some mornings, faint lines drawn into the damp earth that curled into spirals before vanishing under the rising sun. Those who had gone to the city with the researchers spoke less each day until their voices grew quiet and their eyes seemed to wander as if following sounds only. They could hear. One of the guides who had led the team to the plateau was found sitting alone in the rain at the edge of the village, his clothes soaked, his hands resting in the mud. When asked what he was doing, he replied that he was waiting for the mountain to speak again, his voice flat and certain. The elders pulled him away and kept him inside until the weather cleared. But that night, he slipped from his bed and vanished into the darkness, leaving only a trail of wet footprints that ended at the narrow path leading upward toward the stone. Weeks later, a pair of shepherds climbing the high pastures claimed they heard the whispers, even though the day was bright and dry. The sound had come from far above, rolling down the slope like distant water over rock. They said it was not the wind, because it did not move, it lingered and followed them, their steps quickening until they left the plateau far behind. The legend spread beyond the village and into the towns below. Travelers came with cameras and microphones, eager to prove or disprove the stories. Some returned with nothing but blurred photographs and faulty recordings. Others did not return at all. A journalist from the capital, who had spent 2 nights camped beside the stone, came back pale and trembling, unwilling to speak on what he had heard in the rain. His editor reported that he resigned without notice, leaving the city to live alone in the foothills where the storms could be watched but never felt. The stone itself changed, or perhaps those who saw it changed. Its carvings appeared deeper, more defined, as if freshly cut, though no tool marks could be found, and in some places new symbols seemed to emerge, faint at first, then sharper. With each passing month, none matched any known language, though one archaeologist insisted they were a kind of map, not of land, but of sound patterns that could guide a listener towards something beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. During one summer storm, a group of hikers sheltering in a nearby cave claimed they saw a pale blue shimmer across the plateau, like mist rising from the ground, yet the air was clear between them and the stone. The light seemed to pulse in time with the rain, each flash revealing, for an instant, the faint outline of a figure standing beside the monolith, motionless and watching. The government eventually restricted access, citing the need to preserve a rare cultural site, but the villagers said it was because too many outsiders had come back. Changed. They spoke of a sickness that began not in the body, but in the mind a slow turning of thought toward the mountain, until nothing else mattered. The afflicted would climb higher each time the rains came, listening for hours, until their voices joined the whispers in words no one else could understand. One rainy season, a geologist from a distant university was granted permission to study the plateau. He brought instruments to measure vibration and electromagnetic fields, placing them in a ring around the stone. For 2 days, there was nothing but wind and mist. Then, on the third afternoon, the rain began, and the voices came. The equipment recorded nothing but static. Yet the geologist kept staring at the stone, his lips moving to form words that no one else could hear. When the storm passed, he packed his tools without a word and left before nightfall. He did not file his report. The villagers say the stone does not speak to everyone, only to those who are listening in a certain way. Some hear nothing but the hiss of rain, others hear a murmur that pulls at the edges of their thoughts, and a few hear it clearly, as if someone stands just behind them, speaking in a voice older than the clouds above. No one knows who placed the monolith on the plateau. Some believe it predates the earliest people of the region, a remnant of something that came before the mountains themselves. Others think it was carved by a forgotten culture whose name was lost to the centuries, though the elders tell a different story. They say the stone was never carved at all, but brought here whole and set into the earth by hands that were not human, left as a marker or a message for those who would come after. When the storms gather over the peaks, the village grows quiet. Doors are barred, fires burn low, and no one walks the paths leading upward. The children are told that to listen too closely is to be called by name, and once the stone calls you, it will call again until you answer. The call is patient. The call waits in the sound of water on stone. Far away in a city library, a single page of notes from the vanished expedition rests in a locked drawer. It contains a rough sketch of the plateau, the stone at its center, and a series of jagged lines drawn beside it. The lines resemble the patterns of falling rain, yet they are not random. Each curve and drop arranged with care, as if meant to be read aloud. The final line of the page, written in a hurried hand, says simply, "It is not speaking to us, it is speaking through us." And in the high places where the clouds break and the rain falls hard, the stone still stands dark and with its voice lost to the wind, except for those who step close enough to hear what waits within. The sea off Japan's coast is not always gentle. On calm mornings it can lie as smooth as glass, the horizon stretching into a pale haze where water meets sky. But in certain places, even when the waves are still, the ocean feels watchful. One such place is a small, jagged island barely visible from shore. It rises from the water like the spine of some half-buried creature, its rocky slopes choked with wind-twisted trees. No one lives there. No one has for centuries. Fishermen call it Kurashima, the Black Island. They avoid its waters except when the tides drive them too close. And even then, they keep their eyes on the horizon, never on the island itself. On moonless nights, strange lights are said to rise from the sea around it. Not the flicker of fishing lamps, but cold, steady glows that shift beneath the surface. Sometimes they move in slow circles, sometimes they drift upward, until they vanish into the air, as if swallowed by the sky. The older fishermen say the lights are not for the living, that they are beacons for something that waits in the dark below. In the archives of an old Shinto shrine on the mainland, there are brittle scrolls that speak of the island's fate. They tell of a god, not one of sunlight or harvest, but a god of the deep, whose shrine once stood at the heart of Kurashima. For generations, the priests kept the god's favor with offerings of rice, sake, and fish cast into the sea at certain tides. The water stayed calm, the storms passed the island by, and the fishing boats returned heavy with their catch. But one summer, the records say, the offerings stopped. The reasons are lost. Some believe the priests turned their devotion to a rival deity. Others whisper that the god had begun to demand more than the people were willing to give. Whatever the truth, the scrolls agree on what followed. The sea rose without warning. Waves struck the island in the dead of night, higher than any in living memory. Temples collapsed. Cliffs split and fell into the water. When dawn came, half the island was gone, swallowed by the sea as if it had never been. From that day on, no one rebuilt. The survivors left for the mainland, their eyes hollow, their voices low. They said the god had been betrayed, and in turn had demanded the island's destruction. They said the ruins that remained beneath the waves were cursed, and that to enter them was to invite the gods' attention. Centuries later, modern divers came, drawn by rumors of submerged temples and carvings untouched since the night the sea claimed them. They brought their gear and their lights and descended into the green-blue silence below. What they found was strange, even by the standards of underwater ruins. Stone steps still led down into courtyards filled with silt. Walls stood at sharp angles, their surfaces carved with figures whose faces had been deliberately defaced, smooth, empty ovals where eyes and mouths should have been. In the largest chamber, a great stone altar rested in the shadows, its surface etched with curling lines that shimmered faintly when the divers' lights passed over them. It was there that the fear began. One diver later described it as a sudden weight pressing down on the chest, as if the water itself had thickened. Another said it was not fear at all, but the overwhelming certainty that something in the darkness beyond the walls was aware of them and was moving closer. They cut their dive short, leaving behind cameras and tools in their hurry to reach the surface. Back on the boat, none of them spoke for hours. 2 of the divers refused to return to the site. One left Japan altogether within the month and never worked underwater again. Those who did return tried to bring recording equipment, but it failed in strange ways. Video feeds would distort into twisting bands of light. Audio recordings were filled with a low, droning hum that rose and fell in time with the divers' breathing. Even when the equipment worked, the footage often showed things the divers swore were not there. Flashes of pale shapes in the distance, shadows that moved against the current, patterns in the silt that looked like script until they were disturbed and vanished. Local fishermen took these stories as confirmation of what they already believed. They said the sunken god had never left, that it still lingered in the ruins of its temple. The lights seen from the shore were its summons, and those who followed them beneath the water were offering themselves willingly. But the most unsettling accounts came not from the divers or the fishermen, but from people who had never set foot on a boat. Visitors staying at inns along the coast sometimes reported dreams of standing on a seabed beneath a roof of shifting water. The columns and walls around them were lit by a pale green glow, and in the center stood a figure carved from stone. It was too large to be human, yet its long arms ended in hands that rested lightly on the altar. In the dream, the figure would turn its faceless head toward them, and the water would begin to rise. The dreams always ended before it reached their mouths. The rains came early that autumn, and with them storms that rolled in low and heavy across the coast. Fishermen stayed in port, their boats rocking at their moorings, as the wind hissed through the narrow streets of the village. Out beyond the breakwater of the island was barely visible a black shape against the shifting slate of the horizon, yet on certain nights a glow still rose from the water, pale and steady, drifting upward before fading into the dark sky as though swallowed by the clouds. It was during one of these nights that a new team of divers arrived. They had heard the stories, but spoke of them with easy laugh to their wetsuits and tanks gleaming under the docklights. They claimed they would chart every corner of the submerged ruins and return with proof of the sunken gods. Temple the villagers, watch them go, without blessing and without farewell. The sea was restless as they crossed to the island, a slow heave under the hull of their small boat. When they reached the dive point, the water was a deep green shot, through with silver. As the light struggled to pierce it one by one, they slipped below the surface, their lights cutting narrow cones through the haze. At first the descent was uneventful. Columns rose from the silt encrusted with coral and slow waving fronds of seaweed. Small fish darted between cracks in the stone walls, yet the deeper they went the quieter it became, until even the sound of their own bubbles seemed muffled. They passed the carved steps and entered the outer courtyard, where the figures with faceless heads stood in silent rows, their hands clasped before them like attendants waiting for a ceremony that had never ended. The lead diver signaled toward the largest structure, its doorway framed by pillars carved with curling patterns that seemed to shift in the light. They moved inside into a chamber where the altar loomed, just as the earlier teams had described it. The lines on its surface caught the glow of the lamps, and for an instant the water above it rippled, as if stirred by something vast and unseen. It was then that the pressure began, a weight settling on their shoulders and chests. Though their depth had not changed, one diver reached for the altar, as if drawn by it, his fingertips barely brushing the stone before his body stiffened. The others pulled him back, but his eyes behind the mask were wide and unblinking, his air regulator slipping from his mouth, bubbles streaming upward in slow spirals. They carried him toward the surface, fighting the current that now seemed to push against them. They broke into the open air, gasping, but the diver did not speak. He stared at the sky, his lips moving in silence. Later on the boat, he began to mutter in a low voice the words strange and clipped as if spoken through water. None of the others recognized the language. He refused to dive again. 2 of the remaining divers returned to the site the next morning, determined to retrieve the cameras left behind inside the temple. They found the equipment where it had fallen, but the video feeds showed only shifting bands of green and black. As they turned to leave, one of them glanced back and froze in the doorway of the chamber. Where the altar stood, something had moved. The faceless figures that lined the walls now stood closer, their arrangement subtly changed as though they had stepped forward. While the divers' backs were turned, back on shore, they found their recordings intact, yet every frame from inside the temple was distorted by a faint shimmer, the same pale light seen from the mainland on moonless nights. The soundtracks carried a low, unbroken hum that rose and fell like the surge of a distant tide. Listening to it for more than a minute left them dizzy, their vision swimming as if they too were underwater. That night the village was restless. Dogs barked at the sea, and children cried in their sleep. One old fisherman claimed he heard voices in the waves calling from far beyond the shore. When he went to his window, he saw the glow on the water brighter than ever before, moving slowly toward the coast. He shut his shutters and did not open them until dawn. In the weeks that followed, the weather calmed, but the divers who had entered the temple grew pale and thin, their nights haunted by dreams they would not describe. One left the country without notice. Another was found standing at the edge of the pier before sunrise, staring toward the island, his clothes soaked, though he had no memory of entering the water. The diver who had touched the altar remained withdrawn, speaking only in short phrases in that same strange language until he too disappeared, his wetsuit and gear found neatly folded on the shore. The villagers began to avoid the coast entirely. After dark, fires were lit in the streets, and at the shrine, in hopes of keeping the gods' gaze away, the priest poured sake into the waves and bowed 3 times. Yet he admitted to the elders that he could feel something vast stirring beneath the island, not anger exactly, but attention, patient and unblinking. In the city, an academic who examined the divers' footage noticed faint patterns hidden in the distortion shapes that repeated at intervals too precise to be chance. When enhanced, they resembled the spiral motifs found on certain stones of the ruined temple. He believed they formed a kind of script, a message meant to be read, not with the eyes, but with the mind. When he presented his findings at a private meeting, one of the attendees abruptly left the room, pale and shaking, claiming to hear the sound of waves, though the windows were shut and the night outside was still. Out beyond the shore, the island waited, the trees on its slopes bending in the salt wind, the rocks black and wet with spray, the sea around it calm now, but holding the memory of storms in its depths. And when the tide was right and the sky was without a moon, the lights would rise once more from the darkness below and drift upward until they vanished into the air, as though returning to some place far beyond sight. The villagers say the sunken god sleeps in its broken temple, waiting for the day it will be called again. They say the glow in the water is not a lure, but a promise that those who see it will one day stand before the altar in the green silence of the deep and hear the words meant only for them, words that once spoken cannot be forgotten, words that will carry them into the darkness where the god waits. And when the storms come again, when the rain hammers the shore and the waves climb the cliffs, the people will bar their doors and listen to the sea, knowing that somewhere beneath it the god is speaking and someone is listening. The jungle in Cambodia has a way of swallowing what it does not want found. It is not a sudden thing. The vines creep slowly. The roots push silently. The soil rises year by year until stone and story alike are buried under a green that does not care what lies beneath. Somewhere beyond the well-trodden tourist routes, past where the guides are willing to go, there's a clearing where the trees part in an almost perfect circle. At its center stands the temple. From a distance, it looks like countless other forgotten shrines, walls slumped under the weight of centuries, carvings half erased by lichen, doorways leaning as though tired of holding their own weight. But there is something different here. The air inside the clearing feels thicker, heavier, and time behaves strangely. The first thing most visitors notice is their watches, a ticking second hand that hesitates, a digital face that freezes without warning. Some write it off as heat or humidity, until they step back into the jungle and find that the clock begins again as if nothing happened. Others notice the shadows. They seem to lean at the wrong angles, stretching toward the temple no matter where the sun stands in the sky. The locals call it TERRACOTTA clock, the temple that kills the clock. They speak of it with the same tone they use for places where the dead are restless. They say it was built not as a place of worship, but as a cage. The old stories claim an ancient demon, one that fed on the hours of men, was bound here by a king whose name has been lost. Priests and stonemasons worked for decades to seal it away, building not just walls and halls, but a prison of time itself. The tale goes that the demon could not die. It could only be trapped in a place where moments would no longer move, a place where it would never know another sunrise, nor another night, where it would be locked forever in the same heartbeat. Those who come here rarely stay long. Hunters who pass through the clearing say their steps slow, without meaning to. The air grows heavy in their lungs, their heartbeat slows, and the thought of moving on becomes strangely unimportant. By the time they leave, the sun has shifted far more than they expect. In 1998, a small team of archaeologists stumbled on the temple while following the remnants of an old Khmer road. They camped nearby, eager to begin cataloging the site. The first morning passed without event, or so they thought. It was only when they checked their watches that evening that they realized something was wrong. All 6 of their timepieces, from the newest digital to an old wind-up, showed different hours. Some had lost nearly an entire day. Others had stopped entirely. Their journals from that week tell a story of mounting unease. Tools would go missing and be found again in places no one remembered leaving them. Shadows pooled in corners where there should have been none. One researcher claimed to have heard distant chanting inside the temple, though the rest heard only the stillness of the air. On the 4th day, 2 members of the team entered the main hall to begin measurements. They returned less than an hour later, or so it felt to them, to find the rest of the camp in chaos. The others swore they had been gone for nearly 2 days. Food had run low. Search parties had been sent into the jungle, and the relief on seeing them was tempered by fear. When pressed, the pair could remember nothing beyond walking through the doorway and finding themselves back outside. By the end of the week, the team abandoned the site. Their notes were left unfinished, their photographs blurry or strangely overexposed. When the images were developed, one frame stood out. It showed the entrance to the main hall, the stone lintel carved with curling naga. But there was something else, faint, almost transparent. The blurred outline of a figure standing in the doorway, too tall to be human, its shape distorted as if caught in the middle of shifting. The photograph was quietly archived, never displayed. Since then, a handful of explorers have sought the temple. Some return with stories of losing entire afternoons without realizing it. Others speak of walking in at noon and emerging to find night has fallen, the stars already wheeling overhead. And a few never return at all. The jungle always closes behind them, as if the clearing was never there. The rainy season came early that year, and with it a curtain of mist that clung to the trees. The paths to the temple turned slick and narrow, the jungle pressing in. From all sides a group of 4 travelers made their way toward the clearing, drawn by the old stories and the promise of seeing a place where time itself could be caught. And held in the palm of a hand they carried only light packs, and a single compass, which they trusted more than their watches, for the guides had told them that no clock would live long within the temple's shadow. They reached the edge of the clearing, just as the rain eased. The air felt heavy, almost still, as though the world outside had taken one long breath and forgotten to release it. The stone walls of the temple loomed ahead, tangled in vines and moss, their surfaces slick from the passing storm. One of the travelers laughed softly, saying it was only an illusion, an old ruin playing tricks on tired minds. Yet his voice seemed too loud against the quiet, and the others said nothing. Inside the clearing the light shifted without warning. The sun was still above the canopy, but the shadows leaned toward the temple. No matter where one stood, the travelers stepped closer, the sound of their boots on wet grass unnaturally loud. They passed through the first archway and into the cool, dim air. beyond the carvings along the walls, were faded, but some still showed their shapes warriors, with spears, lines of script that twisted and curled like vines, and in the center of it all a figure with many arms standing over a bound shaped the face of the figure, worn away by time or by intent. They split into pairs, moving through narrow corridors, with a smell of damp stone hung thick. One pair reached a side chamber, where a shallow pool reflected the dim light. The surface of the water was perfectly still, yet in it they saw not their own faces, but the sky above, as if they stood outside staring up through a hole in the roof. Though no such opening existed, one of them reached down to touch the water, and felt nothing, only cold air. The reflection rippled once and returned to its unnatural calm. The other pair moved into the main hall, a long space lined with stone pillars, their surfaces carved in spirals that seemed to shift as the eye followed them. At the far end stood a massive door, its surface black and polished, though no hinges or handles could be seen. One of them checked his watch, finding it had stopped entirely. The second found hers, still ticking, but moving backwards slowly, each second drawing away from the next, until the numbers no longer made sense. A low hum began somewhere beyond the door, deep and steady like the sound of a distant drum. They stood frozen, unsure if it was in their ears or in the stone itself. Then the light in the hall changed in an instant. The beams that had filtered through cracks in the ceiling were gone, replaced by a dull silver glow, as though the world outside had been replaced with another entirely. Their shadows stretched and bent across the floor, twisting toward the black door as if drawn to it. They turned back the way they had come, but the corridor did not look the same. The carvings were different, the air colder. One of them swore they saw movement at the edge of the light, a long, slow shape that vanished. When they looked directly at it, they hurried on, the hum growing louder with each step, until it was in their bones, in their teeth, in the slow pulse of their hearts. When they emerged into the clearing, the sun was gone, the stars bright and sharp overhead. Though it had been only late afternoon when they entered the temple, the rain had returned in a thin, cold sheet, soaking the grass and making the stones glisten. The compass needle spun slowly, refusing to settle. The four travelers stood in silence until one pointed at his watch. It was ticking again, but the time was 3 days ahead of when they had entered. They left the jungle at first light, speaking little of what they had seen in the days that followed. Each of them found small changes in themselves, not in the body, but in the mind. Moments when the world seemed to stutter, when voices sounded distant though the speaker stood beside them, and at night dreams of standing in the main hall, the black door ahead of them, the hum rising until it was the only sound left in the world. In the village closest to the path, an elder told them what the guides had not. She said the temple was not built to keep a demon in, but to keep time itself from escaping, that long ago a rift had opened in the flow of days and nights, and something stepped through, something that began to drink away the hours of anyone who came near it. The king of that age had commanded the temple be built over the wound, sealing it in stone and shadow, binding the flow so that it could not spill into the world beyond. She warned them that time taken by the temple was never given back, that those who lost hours lost more than they knew, and that the dreams would not fade until the temple called them again. One of the travelers asked if there was a way to break the call, but the elder only shook her head, saying that the call was not in their ears, but in their hours, and hours, once taken, are never returned. That night, as they prepared to leave for the city, one of them stepped outside the small guest house and looked toward the jungle. The sky was clouded, yet for a moment a pale silver glow seemed to drift above the trees in the direction of the temple. The hum returned faint and steady in the back of their mind, as if reminding them that the door was still there and that the hours beyond it were still waiting. And somewhere deep in the vines and stone of the jungle, the temple stood in silence, its shadows leaning inward, its halls unmoved, its black door listening for the sound of footsteps drawing closer once more. It was found beneath layers of silt and crushed amphorae, in the hold of a shipwreck that had slept for centuries at the bottom of the Mediterranean. The divers had been searching for little more than trade goods, jars of oil, fragments of pottery, perhaps a bronze coin or two. What they brought up instead was something the sea should have kept. The mask was gold, the kind of deep, burnished gold that swallows light and gives it back in slow, liquid gleams. Its features were smooth and symmetrical, the mouth a faint, knowing curve, the nose long and straight. But it was the eyes that drew every gaze, wide, slightly almond-shaped, and darkened around the rims, so that the hollows seemed deeper than they should be. The longer one looked, the more it seemed as though the eyes were not empty at all, but holding something just out of sight. No one could name the culture that had made it. Its style was not quite Greek, not quite Phoenician, not quite anything that could be neatly placed in the history of the region. Tests suggested it was older than the shipwreck itself, a relic carried across waters that had claimed it for reasons no one could say. From the moment it was lifted from the sea, the stories began. The first diver to touch it swore he felt a warmth in the gold, as though it had been lying in the sun. Another claimed he saw his own reflection in the metal, but the face looking back at him was older, gaunter, the eyes deep in shadow. It was sold quietly to a private collector in Marseille, a man with a taste for rare funerary pieces. He displayed it in the center of his study, lit by a single lamp so that the gold seemed to watch from the shadows. Within weeks, his friends remarked on the change in him. He was thinner, distracted, and spoke less than before. When they pressed him, he said only that he had been having dreams. The dreams were always the same. He lay in darkness, the weight of earth pressing down on him, the air thick and stale. Somewhere above, voices murmured in a language he did not know, and gold gleamed faintly through the soil, moving closer until it filled his vision. When he woke, the mask would be the first thing he saw, its dark eyes fixed on him from across the room. 3 months after acquiring it, he was found dead in his bed. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, only the expression on his face, a twisted grimace of panic, as though he had died in the moment of his final breath. The mask was sold again, passing into the hands of a London antiquities dealer who told no one of its history. She kept it in her home rather than in her shop, perhaps drawn by its strange allure. Her neighbors said they often saw her curtains drawn at midday, faint lamplight flickering behind them. When she failed to open her shop for a week, they forced the door. She was found lying on the floor of her study, eyes wide, mouth open as though trying to scream. The mask was on the desk beside her, turned toward the door. By then, the legend had begun to take shape. The mask chose its owner, and once chosen, there was no turning away. The dreams came first, vivid and suffocating, then the slow unraveling, the way the days slipped into nights without meaning, and finally, the quiet death in sleep, with no sign of why or how. The last private collector to own it was a wealthy shipping magnate from Athens. He bought it despite warnings, calling the tales nothing more than superstition. For nearly a year, he seemed untouched, no illness, no nightmares he would admit to. Then, without explanation, he sent the mask to a museum, saying only that it should be kept somewhere it could not be seen by the public. When asked why, he said 6 words, each one slow and deliberate. It remembers the faces it sees. The museum accepted the mask with quiet reluctance. It arrived in a plain wooden crate lined with dark cloth, as if the absence of ceremony could dull its presence. The registrar, who unpacked it, said she felt a weight in the air before the gold even caught the light. She placed it on a table in the conservation room, her gloves, whispering over the surface. Yet she avoided meeting its eyes, telling herself it was habit and nothing more. It was stored deep in the vault beneath stone and steel, where the air stayed cool, and the walls seemed to swallow every sound. The vault had no windows, only a single heavy door, and the constant hum of climate control machines. Here the mask sat upon its padded stand wrapped in soft linen, but even unseen it seemed to press against the mind of anyone nearby. The first to notice was the night guard. He had walked the same route for years without incident, yet now, when he reached the aisle where the mask was kept, he found himself slowing, his footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. Sometimes he would think he heard a breath behind him, a faint shift of cloth. He told himself it was the machines, until one night the hum of the air units faltered for a moment, and in the brief silence he heard it clearly, a whisper so soft it might have been the scrape of metal, yet it shaped itself into something like a word. Soon after, the archivist assigned to catalog the mask began staying later than usual. She said the work was tedious, and she preferred the quiet hours, but the other staff noticed her eyes had grown ringed and hollow. She carried a faint smell of dust, as if she had been somewhere long closed. When she finally took a day off, her notes were found scattered across her desk, page after page, filled with the same sentence written over and over: I cannot wake up. Security cameras in the vault began to fail, not all at once, but in a slow pattern that crept inward toward the shelf, Where the mask was kept, the images warped at the edges, the colors shifting toward gold and shadow until the feed went black each time the technicians replaced the unit. It would work for a few nights before failing again. The director of the museum ordered the mask moved to a deeper section of the vault, one that required 2 keys and a code known only to 3 people. Yet, after the move, the problems did not stop. The guards reported losing track of time within the vault. They would check their watches, see that only minutes had passed, then step outside to find an hour gone. One guard swore he saw his own reflection in the steel door, but the face staring back had its eyes closed as if sleeping. One evening, a researcher requested access to the mask, claiming she wanted to study the gold work under new spectral imaging. She entered the vault alone and did not emerge for nearly 4 hours. When she finally stepped into the corridor, she seemed dazed, her hair damp, as though from sweat. She carried no tools, no notes. When asked what she had seen, she only said it was looking for someone. In the weeks that followed, the staff turnover in the vault rose sharply. Those assigned to work near the mask developed headaches or bouts of sudden vertigo. One guard was found asleep, standing upright in front of the shelf, his eyes open yet unfocused. He was removed from duty and later admitted he had been dreaming of lying in a narrow space, unable to move, the mask above him like a ceiling of gold. The board of trustees began to discuss whether the mask should be returned to storage offsite or perhaps even reburied, but no decision was made. The object remained in the vault, its linen wrappings replaced, its stand polished, and each time a new person entered to check it, the same pattern repeated. The glance, the pause, the moment when their gaze caught the dark eyes and held there a heartbeat too long. It was during one of the seasonal storms, when the power failed across the city. The museum went dark, emergency lights flickering on in narrow beams. The vault was secured, yet the temperature alarms began to chime. As the climate control dropped, a guard went down to check and found the heavy door to the mask's chamber ajar, the lock intact, but the bolts drawn back. Inside, the beam of his flashlight caught the edge of gold just beyond the wrappings, half fallen away. The eyes turned toward him, though no one had touched it. The next day, the footage from that night was reviewed. It showed the door closed until precisely 2:47 in the morning, when the screen filled with static. After a few seconds, the image cleared enough to show the guard standing inside the room, his light on the mask. He did not move for nearly 5 minutes. Then the screen went black again. The guard could remember nothing beyond walking into the vault. After that, the director ordered the mask sealed in a steel case. The glass smoked so that the details could not be clearly seen. Still, the dreams continued for those who worked nearest the vault, dreams of being beneath the earth, hearing voices above, and feeling the slow shift of weight as soil pressed closer. The worst of them were of the moment the gold appeared through the dark and the eyes opened. The mask has not been displayed since. No public record names it, though its existence is noted in the museum's inventory by a string of numbers and letters. Its last listed location simply marked as secure within the vault. The temperature remains steady, the bolts are locked, the alarms are silent, and yet each time the case is checked, the guards say the same thing, that the eye seems sharper than before, as if they have learned something new. Some say that in the deep hours of the night, when the museum is empty, the steel door hums faintly, as though from a vibration too low to hear with the ear, and that if you stand close enough you will feel it in your bones, a pulse slow and steady like a heartbeat waiting, and if you linger too long you might dream of a place you have never been, a place where the air is thin, the earth is heavy, and the gold waits with your face already in its memory. The Sudanese desert holds its secrets differently than the sands of Egypt. Here the dunes are harder, the wind sharper, the air heavy with an ancient heat that seems to press into the skin and stay there. Scattered among these barren stretches are the pyramids of Meroe, smaller than their Egyptian cousins, but no less haunting in their silence. Most are well known to scholars, their histories mapped and measured, but one stands apart. It rises from a plateau of blackened rock, its sides steep, the sandstone darkened almost to a deep red. There is no carved entrance, no visible passage leading inside, and no sign that it ever held a burial chamber. The locals call it the Beit al-Sawt, the House of Sound. By day, it is nothing more than another weather-worn monument. Its edges catch the sun, its shadow falls long across the stone. But at midnight, when the desert wind dies and the stars gather in a bright, cold mass overhead, the pyramid begins to hum. The sound is low and steady, a vibration that seems to come not from the air, but from the earth itself. It begins faintly, almost imagined, until the stones underfoot seem to join in, trembling with some deep resonance. Those who have heard it say the hum carries for miles, threading through the dunes like a pulse, calling to anyone awake to listen. The elders of nearby villages say it has always been so. They speak of nights when the sound was strong enough to rattle the wooden doors, to make water ripple in clay bowls. Some claim the hum is a warning, others a summons. The oldest story says it is a beacon, calling something back to the earth, something that once stood where the pyramid stands now. In 1972, a small archaeological team set out to study the pyramid's acoustics. They camped 3 kilometers away, well beyond the village line, their tents clustered against the base of a low dune. On their first night, just before midnight, they heard it, the hum beginning as a faint tremor in the sand. They turned on their recording equipment, watching the needles quiver, the dials shift. The sound grew stronger, pressing in from every direction, yet no wind stirred, no animal called out. It was not until they moved closer, stepping toward the dark silhouette of the pyramid, that the hum began to fade. By the time they reached its base, the desert was silent again. The same happened the next night, and the next. From a distance, the hum was steady and clear. Up close, it vanished. One of the researchers suggested the pyramid was built to project sound outward, away from itself, as if speaking to the horizon rather than those at its feet. They tried approaching at different angles, from different distances, but always the result was the same. The moment they crossed some invisible boundary, the sound ceased. It was as though the pyramid knew they were coming. The team's notes from those weeks are careful, precise, and yet they begin to take on an edge of unease. One entry mentions the odd feeling of being watched while standing near the pyramid, though the desert was empty for miles. Another describes the way the stars seemed brighter directly above the monument, their light sharper and colder than anywhere else in the sky. By their final night, the team had decided not to approach. They sat instead on the crest of a dune, equipment spread before them, waiting. When the hum came, it was stronger than ever, a deep, vibrating tone that seemed to reach into their chests. One of them later compared it to standing beside a giant engine, though there was no heat, no movement, only sound. And then, for a moment, the tone shifted. It was brief, perhaps no more than a second, but all of them heard it. The steady hum bent upward, as though another note had joined it, faint and distant. The team leader swore it was an echo, but an echo from where? There was nothing to reflect the sound for miles in any direction. The next morning, they broke camp and left without further study. Their official report spoke of unusual but inconclusive findings. Privately, they told colleagues they would not return. The pyramid still stands alone on its plateau, its angles sharp against the horizon, and each midnight, whether anyone listens or not, it hums into the empty desert. Years passed, and the Beit el-Sawt remained untouched by official expeditions. The desert around it shifted, and settled dunes, swallowing tracks within hours, as if erasing every sign of those who dared approach. Yet the hum at midnight continued, and those who lived within hearing distance learned not to speak of it after dark, as though naming it might draw its attention. In the late 1980s, a group of graduate students from Khartoum traveled to the region during the dry season. They carried new recording devices and infrared cameras, determined to capture what the earlier team had missed. They set their camp farther away than the archaeologists before them, nearly 5 kilometers from the pyramid. Still the hum reached them clear and steady as the stars began to gather overhead. The first night was calm, the air still and the sand cooling underfoot. The sound came at its appointed time, a deep vibration that seemed to rise from below the surface of the earth. They aimed parabolic microphones toward the pyramid. The readouts showed perfect waves repeating at precise intervals. It was unlike wind, unlike the call of any animal they knew yet. When one of them suggested they move closer, the others refused. Until the second night, when curiosity overcame caution, they walked together across the starlit plain, their boots sinking softly into the sand, the hum growing stronger with each step, until they crossed that unseen boundary where the sound vanished as though it had never been there. One of them described it later as stepping from one world into another, the air heavier, the silence pressing inward, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. They stood at the base of the pyramid, its stones faintly warm to the touch, Despite the cool night, there was no entrance, no carving, no mark of any kind, just the angled faces. Rising into the dark, the students circled it slowly, each feeling the weight of the place in their own way. One swore she saw movement at the very top, a darker shadow shifting against the night sky, but when she looked again, there was nothing. On the third night, they decided to test the range of the hum, placing sensors at intervals from their camp toward the pyramid. Just before midnight, the sound began low and steady. The devices recorded without error until the moment the nearest sensor lay within the invisible circle. Then its feed went silent. They repeated the test in other directions, each time the same result. The hum existed only beyond a certain distance, as though meant for ears not standing before it, but waiting somewhere far away. In the years that followed, stories began to spread beyond the villages and universities. Travelers from other countries came to stand on the dunes and listen. Some claimed the sound carried strange harmonics when heard through binocular microphones. Others said they felt in their teeth or bones long after leaving the site. A few reported dreams of standing beneath a black sky, the pyramid before them, the hum turning slowly into a deep rhythmic pulse, like footsteps approaching across the sand. One such traveler, a photographer from Istanbul, stayed longer than most, arriving before sunset and refusing to leave until morning. He positioned himself on a ridge with a clear view of the pyramid, framing it against the stars. At midnight, the hum began, and he took his first long exposure. Halfway through the shot, his camera shut down. Without warning, the battery drained completely, though it had been full minutes earlier. He tried again and again, each time the same result. In frustration, he turned to pack his gear, only to hear the hum change its pitch as it had for the archaeologists years before, the faint second note lingering on the air. The photographer said later that the new tone felt directed at him, as though the pyramid had turned its attention from whatever distant point it called to and fixed instead on his small place among the dunes. He left before dawn without taking another picture. By the early 2000s, satellite imagery confirmed the pyramid's isolation. No other structures lay within 20 kilometers, only a faint outline in the rock, suggesting the plateau might once have been larger. Erosion or something else had eaten away at its edges. Some researchers noted strange mineral readings in the area, traces of metals uncommon in local geology, and speculated they might play a role in the acoustic phenomena, yet none could explain the precision of its timing, the unbroken pattern of midnight hums. There was one final attempt to stay past midnight. A joint team of Sudanese and European researchers who camped within sight of the pyramid. They came prepared with multiple generators, shielded equipment, and enough supplies to last 2 weeks. On their first night, they kept their distance, listening as the hum began exactly when expected. On the second night, they moved closer, entering the silent zone to measure the pyramid directly there. Instruments recorded nothing, yet several team members reported a sense of vibration through their boots, as though the stone beneath them carried a living pulse. On the fourth night, the team leader proposed they remain at the base past midnight, while others stayed outside the boundary to monitor the sound. The plan was simple. The result was not just before the hour. The sky clouded over, the air thick with the smell of approaching rain. Though no storms had been forecast, the hum began weaker than usual, but deepened with each passing second. Those at the base felt the stone beneath them grow warmer, the silence inside the circle sharpening until it seemed to cut the space between breaths. Then came the second tone. It was louder than before, clearer, a drawn-out note that seemed to rise from somewhere far below the pyramid and push upward into the night. One of the researchers outside the boundary described it later as a call answered in kind, though no second source could be found inside the circle. Those at the base felt the warmth shift to a faint tremor, then to something heavier, like the ground settling under a great weight. Several stepped back instinctively, though none could say why. The hum ceased abruptly, leaving only the cool hiss of wind moving across the plateau. The team regrouped at their camp, speaking in low voices, as though not to be overheard in the darkness. They agreed to leave at first light, abandoning the remainder of their planned study. None of their equipment had recorded the second tone, and none could explain the marks they found in the sand the next morning, faint parallel lines leading away from the base of the pyramid, disappearing into the dunes without a trace of where they ended. Today the Beit al-Sawt remains unentered, unbroken, still humming into the desert each midnight. To ears unseen, the villagers still bar their doors before the hour, speaking little of what lies on the plateau, and travelers still climb the dunes to listen, though most leave quickly When the sound begins, those who linger long enough to hear the shift in tone rarely return, and when they do not speak of what they felt standing under the starlight as the pyramid sang to something beyond the edge of sight. The future was supposed to be our shield. Lasers to scan the dark interiors of tombs without setting foot inside. Satellites to map ruins buried deep beneath jungles or sand. Machines to translate the dead tongues carved into stone so that no warning could go unread. Yet the shadows in history have not grown thinner. They have only learned to meet us where we stand. In a clean, climate-controlled lab in Cairo, an archaeologist watched as the digital model of a sealed chamber appeared on her screen. The chamber lay beneath a forgotten temple, its walls lined with objects whose shapes were older than the kingdom itself. The scan showed writing on the lintel, fine, curling marks like threads pulled through stone. She leaned closer, letting the translation program do its work. The words emerged in glowing text. Let the one who opens this place meet the dust before their shadow returns to them. The translation froze her for a moment. It was not a phrase she had seen in any of the texts from this era. It was older, borrowed from a language spoken centuries before the temple was built, and it had survived because it had been carved deep enough to outlast the weather and the centuries. She sent a scan to her team, knowing they would debate its meaning. Poetic metaphor, they would say. A superstition carved to deter thieves. But she had seen too many reports, too many accidents that began with a shrug and ended with a memorial. Thousands of miles away, in the mountains of western China, another team stood at the mouth of a cavern. Their drones flew into the dark, lights sweeping across jagged walls. The images streamed back in crystal clarity, carvings of warriors whose eyes had been filled with inlaid stone, each face turned toward the same point at the far end of the chamber. There, the walls narrowed into a door of black rock. The door was sealed with bronze that shimmered faintly, though no light touched it directly. The instruments registered no heat, no unusual radiation, only the odd fact that every sound within the cavern seemed to echo half a second too late. In Tokyo, a linguist working on the project traced the patterns carved around the bronze door. They were not writing, not in the traditional sense, but sequences of symbols repeated with slight variations. A computer suggested they could be instructions, or a warning. The linguist paused before running the translation. Warnings were for those who did not listen. Instructions were for those who did. Under the Atlantic, a submersible hovered over the black ribs of a structure long buried in silt. Its robotic arms brushed the debris aside, revealing the curve of a statue's face. The eyes were closed, the mouth neither smiling nor frowning. On the base, barnacles hid lines of inscription that no human hand had touched in centuries. As the mechanical brush swept them clean, the sonar picked up a faint clicking sound from somewhere in the wreck. It was regular, like a heartbeat. The pilot in the surface ship above frowned at the readout. It was not interference. It was too clean, too measured. The clicks continued for 37 seconds, then stopped. All across the world, technology has given us eyes to pierce the dark and ears to catch the faintest whispers from the past. But the question is whether we are ready to hear them. For each discovery, there is a cost measured not in money, but in chance. The chance that what was meant to be hidden will not tolerate being seen. Some archaeologists laugh at the idea, calling it coincidence. Others keep their findings quiet, marking certain sites as unsafe. And a few, the ones who have seen too much, leave the field entirely. The hum of servers in the Cairo lab blends with the hum of the air conditioning, a steady, modern rhythm that should be comforting. But on the screen, the chamber waits. Its warning waits. And the archaeologist knows the team will open it, because that is what they do. The future always believes it is immune to the past. The chamber in Cairo was opened at dawn when the streets outside were still quiet, the sky pale and heavy with the warmth. To come, the archaeologist stood beside the door as the laser cutters hummed through stone, each pass precise, and measured sparks falling onto the clean tarps laid at their feet. The barrier was older than the temple itself, slabs of rock that had been repurposed from another place, another time, as though the builders had known the weight of what they were sealing away. When the final section was lifted and the space beyond revealed, there was no rush of air, no cloud of dust, only a stillness, so complete it felt like a held breath. The chamber was narrow, the walls pressed in close, lined with jars and small statues, each facing inward, toward a single low altar, on which lay a bowl carved from some dark green stone. A thin layer of fine powder rested in the bowl, catching the light. Like ground glass, one of the assistants stepped forward to take a sample, and the archaeologist turned away, as if unwilling to watch. In the weeks that followed, the assistant developed a cough, then fevers, then an unshakable exhaustion. Doctors found no cause. His blood tests unremarkable, his scans clear, yet his strength faded, until one morning he did not wake. His death was listed as organ failure, without known origin. The bowl and its contents were sent to a secure facility for study, and the chamber was sealed again, but the scans remained on the servers, their images waiting for anyone who cared to look. Far away in the mountains, the team before the bronze door brought in cutting equipment meant for rock and metal. The first attempt barely marked the surface. The second dulled the blades entirely, as if the metal itself had swallowed the heat and pressure. Without effort, the echo in the cavern deepened with each strike, a resonance that seemed to come not from the walls, but from behind the door. The linguist in Tokyo traced more of the symbols there, arrangement shifting in ways that felt deliberate, almost alive, as if they had been carved to respond to the eye that looked upon them. The translation software offered no words, only the phrase pattern not complete. In the Atlantic, the submersible returned to the black ribs of the structure, sonar mapping the chambers hidden under centuries of silt. The clicks began again, steady and patient. This time the pilot recorded them in perfect clarity. A colleague on board ran the sequence through an analysis program, expecting to see random noise. Instead, the pattern emerged symmetrical and repeating with changes at exact intervals. The pilot turned to the screen and for a moment thought they saw movement within the wreck, a pale shape sliding through the dark, but the cameras caught nothing. Technology connects these distant places in moments, a network of servers relaying data from Cairo, from the mountains, from the ocean floor. Scientists compare readings, images, samples. None admit to anything beyond coincidence. Yet more than one finds themselves waking in the night with the same dream, a door in the dark, a sound like a low hum drawing closer. In a lab in Geneva, a team feeds the recorded clicks into a synthesizer, letting the pattern play in the low range of human hearing. The sound that fills the room is strangely familiar, not like speech, and yet carrying the weight of intention. One of the engineers leans forward, eyes narrowing, as if recognizing something from a half-forgotten memory. In the corner, a monitor flickers, without input. The archaeologist from Cairo travels to Geneva to see the results, bringing with her a drive of new scans from the sealed chamber. She arrives to find the engineers unsettled by what they have been hearing. The clicks loop endlessly, now a background pulse to their work. The scans of the powder from the greenstone bowl show it is not mineral, not organic, but a lattice of unknown structure capable of vibrating at frequencies far below human perception when exposed to certain tones. The linguist from Tokyo arrives next, drawn by the symbols from the bronze door. She studies the pattern for hours, without speaking, finally noting that the sequences align with the intervals and the clicks, as though the carvings and the sound were two halves of the same thing. She cannot say if they are instructions or a key, only that the completion of the pattern would require an element missing from both the carvings and the recorded sound. It is the pilot from the Atlantic expedition who brings the final piece. A video clip taken by a secondary camera in the submersible. One frame shows the pale shape again, but this time the image is sharper, more defined. It is not a creature, not in any familiar sense, but a form of geometry, a twisting symmetry, like the symbols carved in the cavern walls. It appears for only a fraction of a second, then is gone. The team debates whether it is an artifact of the camera or something else, yet none can explain why. The frame rate of that moment is a perfect match for the interval of the clicks. In a conference room, they gather the data, the patterns, the tones, the images, laying them out in a sequence that begins to resemble a map or perhaps a chain of events. The archaeologist speaks first, saying that some doors are built not to keep us out, but to keep something else, and the linguist adds that the warnings carved into stone were not for the people of the past, but for those who would come with the means to open what they could not. The pilot says nothing but watches the looping video of the pale shape again and again. The decision to continue is not made in that room, but it will be made soon. The servers will process the missing element. The tones will be completed, and the patterns will align somewhere in the desert, in the mountains, under the ocean. The hum will answer to itself, and the earth will hear. For now the network hums, with activity researchers unaware of how their pieces fit together, technicians running diagnostics on machines that seem to falter when certain files are open, security systems logging odd surges of static at midnight in 3 different time zones outside. The world moves on the streets, busy, the skies clear, but beneath it all the old warnings remain carved into stone, sung in the deep, heard by those who listen too long. And when the moment comes when the curses meet the future, there will be no sound at first, only the stillness that comes before the air begins to vibrate, and the shadow of something long kept apart begins to return.